It's Wes. And it is the height of wedding season, so my kitchen is a mess, my office is a mess, but it's still time to talk about the brand new, possibly not even released yet, 7artisans 35 1.4. Let's hit it! Some of you might not even know that this lens exists yet. 7artisans typically has been focusing on APS-C lenses, small, reasonably light, compact, manual focus, vintage-inspired lenses. This time, however, they're taking a stab at full-frame, wide aperture lens. They already had a full-frame 35 2.0, but now we're going all the way to 1.4. Now at first glance, this lens does not look like a 1.4 lens. And honestly, I had my doubts about the whole 1.4 aperture performance of this lens. Particularly, I was expecting a lot of cat's eyes around the border of the frame on this. I didn't think that this front element would be wide enough. But we're gonna have lots of image samples coming up. We're gonna find out that this thing actually has some surprises under its tiny little belt. Number 1, build quality. So what could I have to say about the build quality of this super cheap, teeny tiny little manual focus lens? It's metal. This lens, and even the lens cap, is an all-metal construction. Well, except for the glass parts. And this lens is surprisingly heavy. It's just all metal and glass. That's some pretty solid build quality. But wait, that's not all that counts for build quality. We're also talking about how this handles and how this is equipped to handle the elements, and well, this isn't exactly equipped to handle the elements at all. This is not a weather-sealed lens. While I do think that I could throw it down a flight of stairs and then put it back on my camera and it would still work exactly the same as it did before, I wouldn't be perfectly comfortable using this in the rain and in moisture. Additionally, one complaint I have about the build quality of this lens is the location of the focusing ring, which seems a strange nitpick to have. Why is that? Well, it's very close to the camera body. And the focusing ring itself is very sharply knurled. Allows you to get a hold of it, but honestly, I've been building up calluses on my fingertips because this metal is so sharply machined. So what do I think would be good for a manual focus lens? Well, let's have a look right over here. Here we have the Minolta 50mm Rokkor X. And this camera has a beautiful manual focusing ring. It's very soft to move the ring. The ring itself is all rubber textured, and the manual focusing ring is toward the front of the lens, whereas the aperture control is toward the back. So you're not kind of wedging your hand around the back of the lens to get to it. It's just very smooth, very natural. That's right, I'm using an antique lens on my B camera. It's fine. And so, that's just a little nitpick. Overall though, it's pretty solid build quality. Obviously no O-ring at the back. It's a 7 out of 10. Image quality. This is where people didn't expect much of this lens. In the forums, I heard people say some pretty derogatory things about the coming of this lens. Look, it's only $199. What are you expecting? Honestly, I was expecting less. At first glance, at f1.4, wide open, and I mean, why wouldn't you use this wide open from time to time, at least? It looks very soft. It looks incredibly soft. But is it? When you bring it into Lightroom or Capture One, you realize that the apparent softness is actually mostly a lack of contrast and kind of excessive chroma at 1.4. It's not actually that soft. It's reasonably sharp for a cheap lens at f1.4. And when you take into account the size and price of this, it's actually shockingly sharp at 1.4. Now you get a ton of vignetting, pretty much all the way through. It only clears up a little bit way down, closing down that aperture. I'm going to talk about this more in image character. I want to be realistic about the intended uses of this lens. People aren't going to be getting this lens because they want a clinical, exact, and very fine detailed reproduction of what they're taking pictures of. No, people are getting this lens because it's kind of a modern take on a vintage design. It's going to give you a look, a feel, an aesthetic. That being said, the image quality is not fantastic. It's just not as bad as you might think that it would be. I wouldn't even call it bad. It's interesting. But again, as I said, there's a fair amount of chroma wide open, very low contrast. Color reproduction is actually just fine. It's not any further off than any of my other lenses are. So when you switch from lens to lens, your white balance tends to shift back and forth. And this one's no further off than, say, my 35 Zeiss to my 85 G Master. Those are very different lenses with regards to color reproduction and white balance. And this one isn't any further off than that. Just using a little bit of work in Lightroom or Capture One, you can get it back to match pretty much anything else. 95% of the way. And chromatic aberration, well, what do you expect? It's actually not much worse than some of the other wide aperture lenses that I have though, just a little bit worse. Not terrible, but not great either. And flaring, again, not terribly well controlled, but honestly, even though there are coatings on this, and there are definitely worse lenses for flaring, I was hoping that there would be some interesting flaring, and oh boy is it interesting. You can get some beautiful rainbows across it, and anyway, we're talking about image quality right now, not image character, so we'll just tie that up real quick and then segue right from our rainbows. Image quality, it's a 5 out of 10. Not amazing, not terrible, but 5 out of 10. Image character, that's what you're expecting to see with this lens. This isn't a G Master lens of perfection. This is a cheap manual focus lens that you can have some fun with, and boy, did I have fun. The bokeh is very interesting. I was expecting to get some serious swirl, some serious cat's eye around the edges. For some reason, it really doesn't do that. Kind of takes on a slight D shape, but honestly, it holds up toward the edges more than a lot of giant, wide front element lenses that I've used. Not really sure how it manages to do that with this teeny tiny front element. Now, if you're questioning if this is actually 1.4, yes, it is very bright at f1.4. It's even slightly brighter than my Zeiss 35 1.4. So it is getting all that light, it is opening up that aperture, and it holds up pretty well. Now, there's a lot of edging around the bokeh. This is a particular look. I don't like it for some styles of pictures, but if I'm taking a picture that has a lot of class, a lot of style, I do kind of like that look. It's not perfect though, and it gets a little bit noisy, a little bit busy and distracting when there are complex out of focus areas that aren't out of focus enough, a little bit jittery and nervous. And since this is a manual focus lens that honestly is a little bit hard to manually focus, I've been doing a lot of freelancing with it. And in some ways, it's actually easier to get into focus when you're using a mirrorless camera with focus peaking while freelancing. You can just wiggle it around, get your focus peaking, and boom, take your picture. I've had a ton of fun with this lens. The character, I've been super pleased with. I wasn't even planning on using it professionally with client images, but I did, just because I had a really long engagement shoot one day. They wanted tons of different pictures, so I broke into it, and now I'm using it at a lot of professional work, and the clients are loving the pictures. They just have some amazing, beautiful character, very classic look to it. So, it's not perfect, but I have to give this a 9 out of 10 for character. That's what you're going to get when you get a lens like this. Not perfection, but character. Moving on to the next category, autofocus. The autofocus in this lens, well, it doesn't exist. Unlike the 35 1.4 that we're filming on, which has fantastic autofocus. So that's a 0 out of 10. Moving on. Value. Again, that's where you expect this lens to win out. And it kind of does. This comes in at $199 US dollars. That's like 4,000 loonies, I don't know. How do we compare this? Well, there is the 35 2.0 from 7artisans for $179. I've heard that's a pretty solid lens, haven't tried it myself though. Then you have the Rokinon manual focus, 35 1.4. Much bigger lens, $369. It's a trade-off. Samyang autofocus 1.4, that's the cheapest autofocusing 1.4 you can get for E-mount, $799. That's a lot more money than this, but it is higher quality image. I don't really care for the character of that lens though. I've seen a lot of the image samples. It just doesn't get my motor going. Then there's the Voigtlander Nocton Classic 3514, which is honestly the closest in spirit to this lens. Kind of a classic look, classic lens, compact, wide aperture. That one is $700. That is 3.5 times more than this. And then, you know, if you're looking at autofocus lenses, of course, you have the Sigma 3514 for $899, the Sony 3518 for $750, a little expensive, and this lens that we're filming on right here, the 3514 Sony Zeiss, $1,600. 8 of these. That would be cute. I could make a little stack if there's 8 of them. Overall, there's really nothing to compare this to. This kind of quality, this kind of price range. The closest thing would be the Nikon AFS 3518 for crop, and that's $169. That's the only thing I could find that was less than this of any reasonable quality level, and it actually is a higher quality image than this, but it's not full frame. So I have to give this a 10 out of 10 for value. You really can't beat it. If you want cheap, this is gonna give it to you. All right, so what's that give us? It gives us a 31 out of 50 total. Not a strong score. Did you expect a strong score from a $200 lens? No. Did you expect great character? Did you expect some free lensing, not autofocusing, crazy interesting bokeh goodness? Well, yeah, that's what I expected. Is it perfect? No, of course it's not perfect. But if you turn this lens just right and get it just in the right direction, even at 1.4, you can get some surprisingly sharp, surprisingly pleasing results. I recommend it, if you've got some time to spare and some money to spare. There are some links down in the description. If you purchase this lens or anything else through those links, you'll help fund this channel and feed my family. If you have any questions about this, have you tried it? Do you want to know more about it? Let me know down in the comments, and I'll get back to you. Next up, we're going to be looking at some video lighting products. Stick around, subscribe, and hopefully we'll have some more interesting things coming right around the bend. But until next time, go take some photos.